She didn't steal the painting, but the whole world believed she did. In less than 6 hours, Zora Bennett's name was on every international news network, not for talent, not for achievement, but for a video so cleverly re-recorded that even her lawyer couldn't tell the difference. The man she was going to marry turned his back on the camera. And that night, in a rain-soaked alley in Seoul, she collapsed into the arms of a stranger, a man whose name alone struck fear into the hearts of the entire city. If you're watching this video, please like and comment your city name below. I want to know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because everything you think you know about that night is wrong. The rain started somewhere around 11, and by midnight it had turned the streets of Mapogu into black mirrors that swallowed headlights whole. Zora Bennett stood in the corridor outside Gallery 7 with a pair of nitrile gloves still on her hands, and the particular stillness of someone who has just been told something they can't unhear. The kind of stillness that isn't calm. The kind that's the split second before the floor gives out. "We're going to need you to come with us." The man who said it wore a badge from the Seoul Metropolitan Police and had the practiced neutrality of someone who had escorted many people to places they didn't want to go. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The 3 officers behind him formed a geometry that made the hallway feel like a tunnel. Zora looked at her hands. The gloves. She'd been mid-examination of the Joseon piece less than 40 minutes ago, a 15th century landscape scroll attributed to the court of King Seongjong, roughly 18 inches wide and worth more than the building she'd grown up in on the south side of Chicago. She'd been checking oxidation patterns on the mounting fabric. Routine. She did it every Thursday. Now the scroll was gone, and she was standing in a hallway with her hands in the air like she'd already been convicted. "I was in the conservation lab until 8:30, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You can check the log. My badge scan is on record." "Miss Bennett." The officer's tone didn't change. "Please." She went. The interrogation room smelled like industrial cleaner and burned coffee. Someone had left a paper cup on the corner of the table, and the ring it made on the laminate surface was the only thing Zora could focus on for the first 12 minutes. They showed her the footage at minute 13. It was her. Or something that wore her shape with extraordinary precision. Same posture. That particular way she carried her left shoulder slightly higher than her right, a habit from years of bending over light tables. Same gait. The figure on the screen moved through Gallery 7 at 9:17 p.m., carrying what the timestamp and camera angle together implied was a tube case of the kind used for scroll transport. She watched herself commit a crime she had not committed. "That's not..." She stopped, pressed her palms flat on the table. "That footage is altered." "Ms. Bennett, I'm telling you, I was not in that gallery at 9:17. I was in the break room on the 4th floor. There are people who saw me." The detective across from her, Young, his nameplate read, a compact man with reading glasses he kept taking on and off, said nothing for a long moment. He wasn't cruel. That was almost worse. He just looked tired in the way people look tired when the paperwork is already written. "We've spoken to your colleagues," he said finally. "And?" He looked at his folder. "Several of them indicated they did not see you between 8:45 and 10 p.m. She thought about that. Counted the people who would have been in the break room. Min Jun, who always made tea at 9 and who she'd borrowed a spoon from. Yeonji, who'd been on a call by the window. A third person. She was almost certain there'd been a third person, but faces blurred when she reached for them. "Someone tampered with that recording," she said. "We have forensic..." "Someone inside this foundation tampered with it." She leaned forward, and she knew even as she did it that it was the wrong move, that it made her look desperate and not credible. But she couldn't sit still inside her own body anymore. "Have you looked at the restoration corridor, the one behind the East Gallery wall? Because the only way to move something that size out of a secured room without triggering the floor sensors is through that access point, and I'm the person who wrote the protocol that covers it, which means I'm also the person who knows exactly how to use it as a redirect." Young looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook. She didn't see what. By 2 a.m., the news had her name. By 3 a.m., it had her face. By 4 a.m., someone had uploaded her university ID photo next to a zoomed screenshot from the surveillance footage, and the comments beneath it were the kind of thing that existed in a register she'd trained herself not to read, but read anyway. The way you press a bruise to confirm it hurts. The Foundation's communications director, a woman named Park Soo-hyun, who had smiled at Zora precisely twice in the 18 months they'd worked together, released a statement expressing deep concern and full cooperation with authorities. The statement referred to Zora as a contracted specialist, not an employee, not a conservator, a contracted specialist, which was the kind of language that built a wall between an institution and a liability without technically lying. She was released without formal charges at 5:30 a.m., pending further investigation. They kept her phone. They gave her a paper with a case number and the name of a victims' rights organization, which she understood to be its own kind of dark joke. She stood on the steps of the precinct building in the clothes she'd worn to work the previous morning. A charcoal blazer, dark trousers, her good flats that were now soaked through, and she thought, call someone. She couldn't think of who. Her parents were in Chicago. It was 3:30 p.m. there, and her mother would be finishing her shift at the hospital, and her father had been dead for 4 years, and there was nothing either of these facts could do for her right now. She had colleagues, but colleagues was the wrong word for people who had apparently not remembered seeing her the night before. She had Daniel. She looked at her watch, remembered they'd kept her phone, looked up at the street instead. Daniel Park. Her fiancé of 14 months, a Korean-American architect who'd been her primary reason for staying in Seoul after her first contract ended, had not come to the precinct. She'd asked someone to contact him. She didn't know if they had. She started walking toward the subway entrance. She found out about Daniel from a news ticker. She was standing at the bottom of the station stairs, reading the screen mounted above the turnstiles, one of those rotating displays that cycled through weather and transit alerts and headlines, and his name appeared beside hers. Daniel Park, fiancé of accused art thief Zora Bennett, has issued a statement. She read the text 3 times. Her brain refused it the first 2. He said he was devastated. He said he felt deceived. He said he was cooperating fully with investigators and that he'd had serious doubts about aspects of her character for some time. He said he never truly knew her. She thought about the way he pronounced her name, with that slight lean into the first syllable, the way he'd held her hand during her father's anniversary last October, not saying anything, just present. The ring she'd looked at 4 times in the jewelry shop window on Garosugil, before he'd surprised her with it on a Wednesday in February for no reason except that he'd noticed her looking. She walked back up the stairs. Outside, the rain was arriving in force now. Not the polite drizzle from earlier, but something committed and cold that turned the world gray at the edges. She walked without direction because all directions were equally impossible. Her feet took her east along the embankment and then left into the older residential blocks where the streets narrowed and the buildings pressed close and the lights were fewer. She did not cry. She wanted to, the way you want to exhale underwater. But there was something wrong with the mechanics of it, some override her body had put in place. And instead she just walked until the strength went out of her legs. She stopped in an alley, pressed her back against a wall. Brick, cold, through her blazer, real and specific, and there. The rain was coming sideways now, and her hair was plastered flat, and she was shaking, but not from cold, though it was cold, from something that was closer to the feeling of looking over a very high edge. It was the accumulated weight of it. Not just tonight. Not just the footage or the interrogation or the statement Daniel had made while she was sitting in a room without her phone. It was 18 months of smaller moments stacking into this, the way her ideas in meetings somehow always became someone else's summary, the way the senior conservators referred to her impressive background with a particular emphasis that meant they were surprised it was real. The time Dr. Wu, head of acquisitions, had asked if she'd be more comfortable with the outreach and education division, given her communication skills, as though her PhD in art conservation science was a credential she'd arrived wearing by accident. She had been patient through all of it. She'd done the work better than anyone, documented everything, stayed late, smiled in the right places. She had believed, and this was the part that finally broke something loose in her chest, this specific belief, that excellence was a language anyone could read. She slid down the wall, sat on the wet ground, put her face in her hands. She was still there when she heard footsteps. He wasn't running. That was the first thing she registered. Someone who stumbled across a woman sitting alone in a dark alley at 5 a.m. in the rain would pause, or accelerate, or pull out their phone. This man simply slowed, then stopped. She looked up. He was tall. That was the first concrete fact. Dressed in dark clothing, a long coat, well made, not flashy, with the kind of stillness that read not as calm, but as control. He looked like a man who had decided, a long time ago, that the appropriate response to unexpected situations was to simply observe them first. He said something in Korean. She caught enough of it to understand it was a question. "I'm fine," she said, in Korean and then English, covering the bases. He looked at her for a long moment. The rain came down between them, and he made no move to get out of it. "You're not," he said, in English. Accented but precise, the accent something European layered over something else she couldn't place. She opened her mouth to argue and found she didn't have the material for it. "I'm not," she agreed. He didn't say anything else for a moment, didn't crouch down to her level, didn't offer a hand, didn't do any of the things that would have felt like performance. He just stood there, in the rain, like a man who had nowhere more important to be at 5 a.m. and was prepared to demonstrate it. Eventually he said, "There's a car at the end of the street. I don't need—" "It's raining," he said, simply. She looked at him. He met her eyes without urgency, without pity, with something that was so close to neutral it had crossed to the other side of neutral and become its own distinct quality. Like he was looking at the situation and had already accounted for all its variables and was simply waiting for the irrelevant ones to resolve. She was soaking wet and had nowhere to go, and her fiancé had told the cameras he didn't know her. She was also exhausted in a way that made complicated decisions feel like architecture. "Fine," she said. She got up. He didn't help her. She didn't want him to. He turned and walked toward the end of the alley, and she followed. And that was how it started. Not with a choice, exactly, but with the absence of any better one. The car at the end of the street was not a car. It was an SUV, matte black, with tinted windows that were darker than standard. The man opened the rear door, and she got in and found herself in an interior that was very clean and very quiet. And then she noticed the vehicle in front of them, and the vehicle behind them, and then the vehicles on either side of the street. And she understood something had changed in the geometry of the situation. The man got in beside her. A driver she could barely see through the partition pulled into traffic smoothly. She counted the vehicles she could identify through the window. There were at least 8, moving with the kind of coordinated unhurriedness that meant they weren't trying to look like an escort, they just were one. She looked at the man beside her. He was looking forward. "Who are you?" she asked. A pause that was not uncertainty, more like consideration. "Cassian Riker," he said. The name meant nothing to her. She was about to say so when her body, finally, without her permission, decided that the last 24 hours had accumulated enough, and she began to cry. Not neatly, not cinematically, with a kind of physical totality that she couldn't control or frame or make into anything except what it was, which was a person breaking. He didn't say anything, didn't move away, didn't move toward her, just sat there in his corner of the vehicle with the same quality of stillness he'd had in the alley, and outside the dark windows Seoul moved past in the rain, and somewhere in this city a painting was missing and her name was on every screen, and the man beside her said nothing, which was the only thing, at that moment, that didn't feel like a lie. Market. The penthouse was on the 41st floor of a building in Gangnam that didn't have a sign out front. She noticed stepping out of the elevator that the men and women who moved through the space were not domestic staff. They moved too quietly, too deliberately, with a particular attentiveness to sightlines and doors that she recognized from crime procedurals and filed away in a part of her mind she was too tired to open fully. The space itself was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, the kind of view that made the city look like a diagram of itself. No excess decoration. A few pieces on the walls. She caught herself automatically assessing them and stopped, because old habits were apparently more durable than active catastrophe. Cassian led her to a room, a guest room, clean and white and spare, and told her there were dry clothes in the closet and that she could sleep. "I'm not going to sleep," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's something to do." He was almost to the door when she said, "You haven't asked me anything." He stopped. "About the painting, about any of it. You haven't asked me a single thing." He turned slightly, not all the way. "I know what happened," he said. Something cold moved through her that wasn't the wet clothes. "How?" He looked at her directly then, and there was something in his face that wasn't quite readable, but that wasn't empty either, like looking at a locked room and knowing there's something valuable inside. "Get some rest," he said. We'll talk in the morning." He closed the door. She stood in the center of the white room with the city glittering 41 floors below, and the words, "I know what happened," circling her brain like something trying to find a way in. And for the first time in 18 hours, she wasn't thinking about the footage, or Daniel, or the foundation, or her name on a news ticker. She was thinking about a man who had found her in the rain and known her name wasn't on the footage, and hadn't yet explained why. And she didn't know whether that made her safer, or whether she had walked from one dark place into something considerably darker. She tried because there was nothing else to do and her body was running on fumes and old adrenaline, but every time she closed her eyes, the footage played back on the inside of her eyelids. Her own shape, her own gait, her own particular way of holding her left shoulder. Whoever had built that thing had studied her, not casually, with patience and precision and the kind of attention you only pay to something you intend to destroy. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched the city instead. Seoul at 5 in the morning had a specific quality she'd noticed in her first weeks here and never stopped noticing. That thin window between the last of the night people and the first of the morning ones, when the streets belonged briefly to nobody, and the light was the color of an old photograph. She'd loved that about it. Past tense was arriving fast. She found dry clothes in the closet, dark jeans, a gray pullover, things that fit well enough to suggest this wasn't the first time guest clothing had been provided in this room. That thought sat uncomfortable, but she put it on a shelf and kept moving because the alternative was to stop, and she couldn't afford to stop. She found the kitchen by following the smell of coffee. Cassian was already there, standing at the counter with a cup in his hand, reading something on a phone, dressed in different clothes than last night, dark trousers, a simple black shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows. He looked like a man who had also not slept, except on him it read as a choice rather than a defeat. He looked up when she came in. She said, "You told me you know what happened." "Good morning," he said. "It's 6 a.m. and my name is on every news channel in 2 countries. She pulled out the nearest stool and sat because her legs had opinions about standing. "Skip the morning." He considered her for a moment. Then he set down his phone and poured a second cup of coffee and slid it across the counter toward her. She took it because she needed it, and because accepting it wasn't the same as trusting him. "The footage," he said, "the version the police have, was altered. Professionally. Whoever did it didn't use consumer editing tools. The metadata was reconstructed at the encoding level, which means they had either military-grade software or access to someone who builds it." He picked up his own cup. "It also means they did it before the theft was reported, which means the theft and the framing were planned simultaneously. You weren't an afterthought." She felt the coffee go down, felt it land in a stomach that had nothing else in it. "How do you have access to that analysis?" "I have access to most things." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him steadily. "Who are you, Cassian Riker? And I don't mean your name." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he moved around the counter and sat across from her and put both hands flat on the surface, and she had the distinct impression of a man doing something slightly unfamiliar, which was being direct. "I run operations," he said. "What kind?" "The kind that aren't regulated." That's a very clean way to say something that probably isn't clean. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement. "I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise," he said. "What I will tell you is that the network your foundation's chairman has been operating, the one you got dropped into the middle of, has been a problem I've been working to dismantle for a long time. And when they chose you as the face of this, they made it personal in a way they didn't intend to." She set down the cup. Why personal? He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes and then was very carefully put back. Later, he said, you keep doing that. I know. It's infuriating. I know that too. She breathed in slowly through her nose. Outside the windows, the city was starting to sharpen in the early light, the towers pulling themselves out of the gray and becoming specific. Somewhere down there was her apartment with her things in it, and a life she was no longer sure was intact. Show me the real footage, she said. He showed her in a room she suspected served several purposes, only some of which were office-related. 2 walls of screens, a central table with hardware she recognized vaguely as high-end and didn't recognize specifically as anything she'd seen in public retail. A man was already in the room when they entered, late 30s, lean, with the kind of face that defaulted to skeptical. He looked at Zora the way you look at a variable you haven't solved for yet. This is Nate, Cassian said. He handles technical operations. Nate did not offer his hand or a last name. He pulled up a file on the central screen. The footage that appeared was from the same camera system as what the police had shown her, but the timestamp and sequence were different. In this version, Gallery 7 at 9:17 p.m. was empty. The scroll was on its mount. The lights were on their automated dim cycle. Nothing moved except the environmental system cycling on the far wall. At 9:31, a figure entered from the east. Not the main gallery entrance, but a panel in the wall that Zora recognized as the access point to the restoration corridor she'd mentioned in the interrogation room. The figure wore full protective gear, including a face shield, standard conservation equipment, completely anonymizing. A second figure followed. Between them, they moved with practiced efficiency, one neutralizing the floor sensors with a device she'd never seen before, the other beginning the unmounting process with tools that told her immediately, not an amateur. Whoever handled the scroll knew exactly what it was. The whole operation took 11 minutes. At 9:44, Gallery 7 was empty again. She watched it twice. On the second viewing, she was paying attention to the unmounting technique, and a cold precision settled into her chest. The second person, she said. Nate glanced at her. The one who handled the scroll. The pressure application on the lower mounting bracket. That's a specific method. It's taught in maybe 4 programs globally. She looked at Cassian. Someone with real conservation training did this. Or someone trained by someone with real training. Cassian was watching her with that quality of attention he had, the kind that didn't telegraph what it was doing with what it collected. We identified him 3 days ago, he said. A conservator who was removed from the Foundation's staff 8 months before your arrival. He was let go quietly. Discrepancy in documentation, officially. Actually, Dr. Wu dismissed him after discovering he'd been photographing security protocols. She thought about Dr. Wu, his comfortable corner office, his recommendation that she consider the outreach division. Wu knew, she said. Wu is mid-level. He knew enough to remove the threat to the operation, but not enough to understand the full scope of what he was protecting. And the chairman? Cassian's expression didn't change, but something in the room's temperature seemed to. Marcus Che has been running this network for 11 years, he said. Art acquisition, insurance fraud, money laundering through auction transfers. Conservative estimate is $4 billion over the last decade. The Joseon scroll isn't an art theft, it's a transaction. The scroll's insurance transfer document contains embedded financial data, layered in the authentication watermark using steganographic encoding. When it clears the International Insurance Consortium, it releases access to 17 offshore accounts. Zora sat with that for a moment. And they needed someone to look at, she said, while the transaction cleared. 2 to 3 weeks for international insurance adjudication, during which time investigators are focused on the most visible suspect. He looked at her directly. You were chosen because you were credible enough to believe and isolated enough not to have institutional protection. A Black American woman working on a contracted basis in Seoul. Every bias in the system would work against you before you opened your mouth. The coffee she'd drunk earlier felt like it was sitting very still in her stomach. She'd known this, in the abstract. She'd lived adjacent to this knowledge her entire career, the way you live adjacent to a sound you can hear but can't identify. But hearing it laid out in this room, at this hour, by this man, with the footage still on the screen behind him, did something to the abstract and made it concrete and heavy and close. "I want the original footage authenticated," she said. Her voice came out even. She was slightly surprised. "I want a forensic chain of custody that will hold up in an actual proceeding, and I want to know who altered the version the police received, because that person was inside the foundation, and I want their name." Nate looked at Cassian. Cassian said, "We're working on the last one." "Work faster," she said. The name came 5 hours later, and it wasn't a name she expected. She'd spent those hours in the room Cassian had pointed her toward, a library, essentially, walls of books and a desk with a clean surface, which she understood to be a place for her specifically to be away from the operations center while he moved through conversations she wasn't cleared for yet. She'd found paper and a pen and had been doing what she always did when her brain needed to process something too large. She wrote it down in pieces. Everything she remembered from the night before the theft. Every person she'd seen, every access door she'd logged. Cassian came in and stood in the doorway. "Daniel Park," he said. The pen stopped. "He provided the updated security schedule 2 weeks ago," Cassian continued, "the one that reflected the new motion sensor calibration in the East Gallery corridor. Without that information, disabling the floor sensors in the sequence the thieves used wouldn't have been possible." She looked at the pen in her hand, the paper in front of her. She'd written Daniel's name on it already, because she'd been reconstructing everyone who had access to her professional life, and there he was, third from the top. "He knew," she said. "He's been in contact with an intermediary connected to Che's network for at least 6 months. We have communication records." 6 months. She set the pen down. "We got engaged 8 months ago." Cassian said nothing. "He proposed, and then 2 months later he started feeding them security information." She looked up. "Was any of it real? Did they put him up to the engagement, or did he—" "We don't know the full sequence yet." "That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring, it's what we know." She stood up. The room was large enough that she could take several steps, and she did, moving to the window, looking at the street 41 floors down. People moving, cars. Ordinary Thursday in Seoul, except it wasn't. "He stood in front of cameras this morning," she said. "He told them he never knew me." She heard her own voice doing something tight and controlled with something that wanted to not be controlled. "He could have just stayed quiet. He didn't have to say that." "He was told to say it," Cassian said. "It adds credibility to the frame. A fiancé who defends you is a liability. One who denounces you is confirmation." "He didn't have to do it." "No, he chose to." She faced the window for another moment. There it was. The specific, small, terrible clarity of a thing understood completely. She turned around. "What do you need from me?" she said. What Cassian needed was her expertise, and the way he explained it was economical. The stolen scroll, wherever it physically was still documented as being in the Foundation's possession for insurance purposes. It would need to pass an authentication review before the insurance transfer could clear. That review would be conducted remotely using high-resolution imaging, standard practice for insured cultural artifacts in transit. The authentication would go through 3 experts. 2 of them were already compromised. The third was a retired conservator named Dr. Ingrid Solberg, based in Oslo, who was reportedly the only independent voice in the consortium that hadn't been bought. "They're going to try to sideline her before the review," Cassian said. "We have 48 hours, maybe less, to build a parallel authentication case using the original provenance documentation the Foundation holds but that Che won't have moved yet because moving it would flag an internal audit." "You want me to access the Foundation's archive," Zora said. "The physical archive, sublevel 2. The records there aren't networked." She understood what he was saying and what he wasn't saying. "You want me to walk back into the building where everyone thinks I stole a priceless artifact?" "With support," he said. "What kind of support?" He looked at her steadily. "The kind that doesn't appear in the official record." She thought about the archive room. She'd been down there twice. Cold, fluorescent lit, row after row of flat files and acid-free boxes going back to the Foundation's inception in 1987. She knew the organizational system, She knew which administrator held the physical key and that he took his lunch at 12:30 and went to the same place every day. She thought about Daniel saying, "I never truly knew her," for a camera. "Fine," she said, "but I want to see the communication records you have on Daniel before we move." "All of them." Cassian nodded once. "And I want to talk to your forensics person alone, without you in the room." Something shifted fractionally in his expression. "Why?" "Because you're the most controlled person I've ever met," she said. "And I don't know yet whether that means I can trust you or whether it means you're very good at something I should be afraid of." And Nate, whatever else he is, looked annoyed when he saw me this morning, and annoyed people are easier to read than controlled ones. A silence. "All right," Cassian said. She'd expected resistance. The lack of it was almost more unsettling. Nate, it turned out, was annoyed for reasons that had nothing to do with her. He told her this approximately 4 minutes into their conversation, with the bluntness of someone who had decided she was going to be in the space for a while and might as well be dealt with accurately. "I've been tracking this network for 2 years, he said, pulling up a map on the side screen. Nodes and lines, connections between companies, foundations, individuals. We were 4 months from a clean intercept point. Then Che moved the timetable up by 6 weeks and used you to do it, which means we either move now with what we have or we lose the window entirely." He looked at her. "So when Cassian brought you here, what I was annoyed about was the timetable, not you specifically." "That's a distinction," she said. "Yeah." She studied the map. Her eyes moved through it professionally, the same way they moved through a painting, looking for structure, for internal logic. "This node here," she pointed. "This one's connected to a gallery in New York, I know. I consulted for them 2 years ago, briefly. They had some unusual acquisition documentation that I raised concerns about and was told I'd misunderstood the provenance conventions in that market." Nate looked at the node, then at her. "You were told you'd misunderstood." "By the senior partner, who I later found out had connections to a collector in Geneva who acquired 3 pieces in that same period that I'd flagged as having questionable origin documentation." Nate turned back to the screen, typed something. A new connection line appeared. He said, "How long have you been doing conservation work?" 11 years? "How many times have you raised concerns about something and been told you were wrong?" She looked at the map, at all those lines, all those nodes, all those clean institutional names covering the geometry of something vast and dirty. "Enough times," she said, "that I started keeping records." Nate looked at her slowly. "What kind of records?" he said. She met his eyes. "The kind that are encrypted and stored in 3 separate locations, and that I would need to be alive and unconstrained and provided with a secure terminal to access." A pause. "I'll get you a terminal," he said. She was midway through the 3rd encrypted file when Cassian's voice came through the room's speaker system. Not raised, just present, which somehow carried more urgency than volume. "We have a problem." She and Nate looked up simultaneously. "The police have issued a formal detention order," Cassian said. "And Che's people have moved up the authentication review. It's not 48 hours anymore." Nate said, "How long?" A pause that was not long but felt it. 14 hours, Cassian said. "The review window opens at midnight." Zora looked at the screen in front of her, at the files she'd barely started pulling apart, at the map on the side screen with its new connection lines and the name of a gallery in New York where someone had told her 2 years ago that she'd misunderstood. 14 hours. And somewhere in the Foundation's sublevel archive was a flat file containing the original provenance documentation for a scroll that was currently in transit to somewhere it was never supposed to go, carrying inside its insurance transfer enough dirty money to keep several governments in comfortable pockets for another decade. She looked at Cassian through the glass partition. "I need 20 minutes to pull the rest of these files," she said. "Then I need a car, a working Foundation access badge, and someone who can tell me whether the sub-level security rotation changed in the last 48 hours. Cassian looked at her for a moment. "The badge is a problem," he said. "Your credentials were suspended at 6 this morning." She'd expected that. She'd already been thinking 3 steps past it. "Then I need someone who still has active credentials," she said. "Someone inside who hasn't been bought." She paused. And I think I know who. The name she was thinking of was Min Jun, the junior conservator who made tea at 9 every night and who had, for 18 months, been the only colleague who ever asked her questions about her work like he was actually interested in the answers, who had borrowed her monograph on Joseon textile restoration twice and returned it both times with small, careful annotations in the margins in pencil, as though he planned to erase them but hadn't yet. The same Min Jun who had reportedly not confirmed seeing her on the night of the theft. She didn't know if that was betrayal or fear or simply the way memory works under pressure from authority. She was about to find out which, and the answer was going to determine the next 14 hours in ways she couldn't fully calculate yet. And if she was wrong about him, it wasn't just the plan that fell apart. It was everything. She called Min Jun from a burner phone Nate handed her without comment. It rang 4 times. She counted them the way you count seconds in cold water. He picked up on the 5th. "It's Zora," she said. Silence. Not long, maybe 3 seconds. But 3 seconds on a phone from a number he didn't recognize, after a night where her name had been on every screen in the city, was its own kind of answer before any words arrived. "I know," he said finally. His voice was low, careful. "I need to see you. Zora, not to ask you to do anything illegal. Not yet." She heard her own voice and noted the yet and understood it had come out deliberately. "I need to ask you what you saw, or didn't see, on Wednesday night." Another silence. Longer this time. "I can't talk on this line," he said. "Then tell me where." He named a coffee shop in Mapo-gu, the kind with no windows facing the street. She knew it. She'd been there 3 times in 18 months, always because Min Jun had suggested it. And she realized now she'd never questioned why he consistently preferred places without sightlines to the exterior. She filed that. 1 hour, she said. "Come alone." She looked at Cassian through the glass partition. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention he brought to everything, the kind that didn't tell you what it was thinking while it thought it. "Fine," she said. She did not come alone. Nate was in a car parked 60 meters south. Cassian was somewhere. He hadn't told her where, and she hadn't asked, because asking would have produced a non-answer, and she was developing a working understanding of which questions were worth spending energy on. The coffee shop was warm and smelled like roasted barley, and was almost empty at that hour. Min Jun was at the back table, both hands around a cup he wasn't drinking from, wearing the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and isn't sure it's going to go the way they rehearsed. He was 26. She'd sometimes forgotten that because he worked with the focused deliberateness of someone a decade older. Right now, he looked 26 in a way that was hard to look at. She sat down across from him. "I didn't see you," he said before she could start. "That's what I told them. I didn't see you in the break room Wednesday night. Were you there?" "Yes." "And did you see me?" He looked at his cup. "Yes." The word landed between them like something physical. "Min Jun." "They called me at 7 a.m. He still wasn't looking at her. "Before the news broke. Before any of it. Someone called me from a number I didn't recognize, and they knew things. About my visa status, about a payment I'd received 6 months ago for a private consultation that I hadn't declared, about..." He stopped. His jaw moved. "They told me what to say, or what not to say, and they told me what would happen to my mother's shop permit if I didn't." She sat with that. The specificity of it, not a vague threat but a targeted one, built from information that had required someone to research him, to prepare, which meant Min Jun, like her, had been factored into this before the theft happened, which meant the frame wasn't just built around her. It was built around everyone who might unframe her. "How long have they been watching you?" she said. "I don't know. I didn't know they were until yesterday morning." He finally looked up. His eyes were red at the rims. "I didn't know it was going to be you, Zora. I didn't know what any of it was for." She believed him. She wasn't sure if that made it better or worse, and decided it didn't matter right now because better and worse were luxuries. "I need your badge," she said. He stared at her. "Your foundation access. Sub-level 2. I need to get into the physical archive in the next 6 hours." If they find out, they're going to find out everything eventually, she said. The only question is whether we find out things first. She put both hands flat on the table. Minjun, they chose you because they thought you were manageable. They were wrong. But that only matters if you decide it does. He looked at her hands on the table, then at her face. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find enough of it. He reached into his jacket and placed his access card on the table. The rotation changes at noon, he said. The guard on sublevel 2 is named Officer Tay. He takes a 5-minute bathroom break at 11:40. Every day. He's done it for 3 years. She picked up the card. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet? He looked out at the empty shop. The administrator who holds the archive key. Mr. Beck. I know him. He was at a meeting with Chairman Che last Friday. I saw them in the corridor. I didn't think anything of it then. She went very still. You're sure it was Che? I've seen him at 3 Foundation events? Yes. She stood up. Stay somewhere they can't reach you easily. Don't use your registered phone. He nodded. He looked like a man in the first moments after making a decision he can't reverse, which was exactly what he was. She walked out. She was back in the car and 2 blocks away when Nate's voice came through the earpiece he'd given her. Small problem, he said. The archive key isn't with Bayek. She'd told Nate about Bayek in the 60 seconds between leaving the coffee shop and getting in the car. He'd apparently spent those 60 seconds running something she didn't have the clearance to see. Where is it? She said. Logged out yesterday morning, 9:17 a.m., to a Dr. Wu Songjin, head of acquisitions. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Wu. Who had suggested she might be more comfortable in outreach? Who had, she now understood, dismissed the compromised conservator 8 months before she arrived so that when the theft happened, there was no other obvious internal candidate with technical knowledge, so that the only viable candidate was her. He's still in the building? She said. Arrived at 8:40 a.m. Has a trustees meeting at 2 p.m. We think that's when they're planning the handoff of the archive documents to someone who can use them to legitimize the authentication review. 4 hours. She looked out the window at Seoul moving past, counted what she had. Minjun's badge, a 6-minute window during Tae's bathroom break, and no key to the archive room itself. Can you get into the archive without the key? She said. Nate was quiet for 3 seconds. Define get into. Don't damage anything. The documents inside are irreplaceable. Then no. Not fast enough. The lock on Sub-Level 2 archive is a physical deadbolt, 1990s ASA Abloy, non-standard cylinder. You'd need the key or 40 minutes and tools that would make noise. She thought. The habit of her whole career was useful in unexpected ways right now. Every problem she'd ever solved in conservation work started with the same principle. You don't fight the material, you understand it first. Wu keeps the key on him or in his office, she said. Can't confirm? He's fastidious, she said. I've worked with him for 18 months. He logs everything physically. He doesn't carry things he might misplace. If he took that key from the log, it's sitting in the center drawer of his desk or in the interior pocket of whatever jacket is hanging on the back of his office door. She paused. He also takes a 40-minute lunch at 12:15 at the restaurant on the 2nd floor, without exception. Nate said, his office is on the 7th floor. Sub-level 2 is 2 floors below ground. You'd have to enter the building, get to 7, get the key, get down to sub 2, find the documentation and photograph it, and get out. All inside 40 minutes. 35, she corrected. I need 5 minutes buffer before the guard rotation completes. Silence on the line, then. This is a bad plan. No, she said. It's a plan with bad odds. Those aren't the same thing. Damned. She did not expect the lobby. She'd used Minjun's badge to enter through the building's east service entrance, a loading dock access used by conservation supply deliveries, which she knew because she'd signed for 7 of them in 18 months, and the badge reader was mounted awkwardly low, and everyone who used it had to crouch slightly. The badge worked. She got in. What she hadn't calculated was the ground floor lobby having a different security presence than it had on a normal workday. 2 men she didn't recognize were stationed at the main reception desk. Not Foundation staff. The posture was wrong, too deliberate. the eye movement of people working rather than performing access control. Private security. Brought in, she guessed, after the theft, under the cover of institutional protection during an investigation, covering something else entirely. She was in the service corridor, watching them through a door's narrow glass panel. Her heart was doing something too fast and too loud, and she breathed through it the way she'd learned to breathe through the panic that came at the end of her first year in conservation, when she'd been told that a piece she'd spent 8 months on was being acquired by an institution she knew had questionable provenance practices, and there was nothing she could do, and she'd had to stand in front of it one last time and just accept the powerlessness. She'd learned then that the feeling passed if you didn't fight it. You let it move through you like weather, and you waited for the other side. She let it move through now. Then she went to the stairwell. Wu's office was the third on the left at the end of the 7th floor corridor. She knew this building's rhythms the way she knew the particular sounds of her own apartment. The HVAC shift at 11. The elevator that ran slow on the way down. The motion sensor in the east corridor that had a 2-second delay she'd discovered accidentally on her 3rd week. She used the delay. She moved through the corridor during the HVAC shift when the ambient sound covered footsteps. His office was unlocked. Of course it was. He was in the building, 4 floors above her, in his trustees' meeting. She pushed the door open and went in. Clean desk. Organized with the specific neatness of someone who found disorder physically uncomfortable. Center drawer. She opened it smoothly, the way she opened drawers containing fragile things, controlled and quiet. Paper clips. A spare pen. A folded receipt, a tube of hand cream. No key. She opened the jacket on the door's hook without taking it off. Inside left pocket. Her fingers found it before she finished the thought. Small, brass-toned, attached to a leather fob with the archive's official sticker. She pocketed it. She was 3 steps from the door when she heard voices in the corridor. She recognized the first voice. Dr. Wu, unmistakable. That particular mid-register quality, always slightly louder than the environment required. She did not recognize the second voice. And that was worse. She pressed herself beside the door frame. The voices were moving along the corridor, getting closer, and she had perhaps 8 seconds before they'd reach the office door, which was most of the way open and which she had no way to close without making noise. She went behind his desk, under it, into the knee hole, pulling the chair in slightly. It was the least dignified position she'd been in a career full of undignified positions, crouched under the desk of a man who'd been engineering her destruction, breathing through her mouth to minimize sound. The voices stopped outside the door. Wu said, "The trustees have signed off. The documentation can be released to the consortium by 2:30. The second voice, "And the archive copy?" "Destroyed this morning. Bake handled it." She closed her eyes. She opened them immediately because closing them made it worse. "The Bennett problem?" the second voice said. "Resolved. She'll be formally charged by end of day. The detention order is already..." "She was seen this morning near Mapogu." A pause, short but significant. "Seen by whom?" Wu said. "One of Mr. Che's people. She wasn't alone." Another pause. Longer. "Who was she with?" The second voice said a name. The name was Cassian Riker, and the quality of silence that followed that name was unlike anything she'd heard from Wu in 18 months. It was the silence of someone who has just understood that the size of the problem has changed by an order of magnitude they hadn't prepared for. She didn't move, didn't breathe more than she had to. Under someone else's desk with a stolen key in her pocket, and the knowledge that the archive copy she'd come here to use as evidence had already been destroyed, listening to the sound of her plan collapsing floor by floor. "Tell Che," Wu said finally. His voice had changed. Something that sounded almost like fear had replaced the comfortable authority. "Tell him tonight changes." The footsteps moved away. She stayed under the desk for 90 more seconds because moving immediately after voices left was the error she'd seen people make in every film she'd ever half-watched, and she was not going to make it now. Then she came out, straightened up, stood in Wu's office with the useless key in her hand and looked at the clean surface of his desk and thought with a cold clarity, the documents are gone. The original provenance records that would have authenticated the real history of the scroll and by extension proven the transfer was fraudulent, gone. Beck destroyed them this morning, which meant Che had known they might be used against him, which meant Che had anticipated exactly this move. She walked out. Down the stairs, through the service corridor, out the loading dock door, into the daylight of the street. She got in the car. Nate looked at her face and didn't ask how it went. She said, "The archive was cleared this morning. Provenance documents are gone. And Che knows Cassian is involved." Nate reached for his phone. She put her hand over his. "Wait," she said. He looked at her. "If Che knows about Cassian, then the penthouse isn't secure anymore. And if the penthouse isn't secure, we're moving timelines. Everything moves." She stared forward through the windshield. "The authentication review at midnight. He's going to try to accelerate it again. Move it before we can build an alternate case." "We don't have an alternate case," Nate said. "Without the provenance documentation, the documentation in the archive isn't the only provenance record," she said slowly. Something was arriving at the surface of her mind the way things arrived when she'd been staring at a damaged painting long enough. Not an idea so much as a recognition. The scroll was loaned to the Foundation 6 years ago by a private collector. That collector is named in the original loan agreement, which is a separate document kept in a different department, exhibition records. Also in the building, 4th floor exhibition archive. It's not a secured room, it's a filing system accessible to any staff member with an active badge. She looked at Minjun's card still in her hand. "You just came out of that building," Nate said. "I know." "They know your face now, the private security in the lobby." "I know." He looked at her. "This is worse than the last plan." "Significantly," she agreed. She was already dialing. The burner phone rang twice before Cassian picked up. "The archive is empty," she said, "and your name is in play. Whatever safe position you were in an hour ago, you're not in it anymore. I need you to tell me something." A pause. Traffic sounds through the line, which meant he was also in a vehicle, also moving. "Ask," he said, "why are you really protecting me?" She kept her voice level. "Not the version where you tell me later, right now, because the plan just fell apart, and the only thing I have left is you, and I need to know if that's actually something." Silence on the line. Long enough that she thought he might redirect again, might offer patience as a substitute for honesty. Instead he said, "Your father, Dr. Raymond Bennett. He ran a medical humanitarian mission in Eastern Europe 14 years ago. My sister was 17. She was sick in a way that the local infrastructure couldn't address, and there was no reason for an American doctor to spend 3 weeks working to keep her alive. But he did." She heard this. Let it settle into her. "She's alive," Cassian said, "because of him. And I have spent 14 years paying debts. His is the only one I haven't been able to close, because the man is dead, and there's nothing you can offer a dead man." His voice didn't change register, but something in it shifted slightly at the edges. "You are not a debt, but you are the closest I can come." She sat in the car with that. Her father, Raymond Bennett, who had died of a cardiac event 4 years ago, and who had never, not once, mentioned a girl in Eastern Europe, because that was who he was. "You didn't do it for the credit. You did it because it was in front of you." "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. "I need to go back into the building." A pause. "Tell me what you need," he said. Down. She went in through the loading dock again at 12:19. 4 minutes into Wu's lunch. The private security had shifted. One of the two from the lobby was now visible on the second floor through the stairwell window, which meant they were rotating, which meant the lobby briefly had reduced coverage. She went up, not down. 4th floor. Exhibition archive. She knew the filing system because she'd used it twice for provenance cross-referencing on pieces that came through conservation. Loan agreements were filed by year and then by exhibition title. 2018, the Foundation's Joseon retrospective. 3rd drawer from the top, 2nd cabinet on the left. She found the loan agreement in 40 seconds. Original collector, Han Beom-soo, a private collector based in Busan whose estate had been inherited by a family trust upon his death in 2021. The loan was registered with the Cultural Heritage Protection Board under Agreement Number 774-JD. That registration number was public record. It was filed with a government body. It was not something Marcus Che could instruct Beck to destroy in the Foundation's archive, because it didn't live in the Foundation's archive. She photographed every page with the small camera Nate had given her. Her hands were steady. She'd stopped being surprised by that. She was closing the drawer when she heard the elevator open. Not Wu. He'd need another 20 minutes. Not Min Jun. The footsteps were heavier, multiple sets, and moving with a purposefulness that didn't sound like staff. She went to the window at the end of the room. 4th floor. Fire escape on the building's south face, which she knew about because she'd looked at it from outside, and because conservation people always knew the secondary exit. She had the window up and one leg out when the exhibition archive door opened. The man who came through it was not private security. He was not police. He wore no identifying anything. He was large and unhurried, and he looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has been sent to solve a problem and has located the problem. He said in English, "Mr. Che would like you to come with him." She was half out a 4th floor window. She said, "No." And she went down the fire escape fast, the metal ringing under her boots, the cold air hitting her face and the city opening up below her and behind her. She could hear the window taking another body's weight. And the calculation she was running was simple and terrible. 4 floors, external ladder, the man above her was bigger and slower, but the gap was closing, and at the bottom of the fire escape was an alley she didn't know. And in that alley was either Nate's car, which she told him to reposition south, or nothing. 3 floors. 2. She hit the drop ladder at the 1st floor, and it screamed on its tracks going down, the sound bouncing off the alley walls. And she dropped the last 6 feet and landed hard and wrong on her left ankle. And the pain was immediate and real. And she ran anyway because the alternative to running on a wrong ankle was not running, and not running was not a real option. The alley opened left. She went left. The car was not there. She ran. Behind her, the fire escape was still ringing. She was 1 block east, and the ankle was getting louder, and she was calculating how long she could maintain this pace, which was not long, when the black SUV pulled across the intersection ahead of her, and the door opened before it fully stopped, and Cassian's voice said her name once, flat and immediate. She got in. The door closed. The vehicle accelerated. Behind them, in the gap between buildings, she caught a half-second glimpse of the man from the archive room standing at the alley mouth, watching them go, not running, not running. She looked at that, turned it over. "He didn't chase the car," she said. Cassian looked at her. His eyes went to her ankle first. She was holding it slightly off the floor, and then back to her face. "No," he said. "He didn't." "That means he doesn't need to." The cold clarity was back, the kind that arrived when the situation stripped everything else away. "They already know where we're going. They know about the penthouse. They let me come out of that building because they want to know what we have," Cassian said. His jaw was tight. "And because Che has decided to accelerate to tonight." "How do you know that?" He looked out the window. The city moved past, indifferent. "Because 20 minutes ago, 3 of my people were removed from their positions around this vehicle by a team I didn't send," he said. "Someone inside my operation is talking to Che, and I don't know yet who it is, which means I don't know what they've given him, which means everything, the footage, the files Nate pulled, your records, may already be." The words sat in the vehicle like something with weight. Zora looked at her hands. The small camera was still in her left fist, the loan agreement photographs on it, the registration number that lived in a government database Che couldn't touch. She'd held on to it through the fire escape, through the drop, through the run on an ankle that was now swelling against her shoe in a way she could feel with each heartbeat. She thought about the man at the alley mouth who hadn't chased them. "How many people know about the penthouse?" she said. "Operationally, 6. "And how many of those 6 have been with you long enough to have been turned?" Cassian's jaw moved. "All of them." "So we can't go back there?" "No." "And we can't use any vehicle or location that was arranged through your regular channels?" "No." She looked at Nate, who was in the front seat not saying anything, which she'd learned was his version of active thinking. "The loan agreement registration number," she said. "Heritage Protection Board. Government database. Can you access it from a clean terminal? Something completely off Cassian's network?" Nate said, "I have a secondary setup, physical location, air-gapped, nothing connected to anything Cassian's people know about." A pause. "I built it 2 years ago when I first started this work. before I brought anyone else in. She looked at Cassian. He looked at Nate. Something passed between them that was old and complicated, and she filed it for later. Go, Cassian said. Nate's secondary location was a third-floor unit above a dry-cleaning business in Yongdeongpo that smelled like solvent and warm fabric and had blackout curtains on every window. The hardware setup inside was modest compared to the penthouse, but it was running and it was clean, and when Nate sat down and started working, his hands moved with a different quality, faster, less careful, like a musician playing without an audience. Zora sat on a metal chair and took her left shoe off. The ankle was not broken. She'd broken a bone before. In her first year of graduate school, falling from a library ladder, and this was different, a deep muscular protest rather than that specific white-hot wrongness. Sprained, bad enough. She wrapped it with the compression bandage from the first aid kit. Nate pointed her toward and put the shoe back on because she was not going to be in a position where she couldn't move. Cassian was on a phone she hadn't seen before. He was speaking quietly, in Korean, and his voice had a register she hadn't heard from him yet, something clipped and cold, and that carried under its surface the quality of a door closing. When he finished, she said, "Who did you just call?" "Someone who isn't connected to the compromised network." "Who?" He looked at her directly. "A prosecutor, in the National Office for Investigation. She's been building a separate case against Che for 14 months on financial crimes alone. She doesn't have enough for charges. We give her what you pulled from that building and what we have on the surveillance alteration, and she has enough to freeze the insurance transfer before midnight." Zora processed that. "You know a federal prosecutor. I know several federal prosecutors. And you're comfortable calling them." "I'm comfortable using every tool available." His eyes didn't move from hers. "That's not the same thing as being comfortable." She let that sit. Then, "The mole. Whoever is feeding Che information about your operation, if we move through this prosecutor and that person knows about it, they don't know about her. She's outside every channel they've seen." "You're certain?" "No," he said, "but certainty isn't something this situation offers. We move on best probability, and we move fast." Nate said from the desk, "I'm in the Heritage Board database. Registration 774-JD is active and complete. Original loan terms, physical description of the artifact, collector provenance, back to 1987. And," he leaned closer to the screen, "a secondary notation, conservation authentication record from 2019, signed by an independent expert." He looked over his shoulder. "Dr. Ingrid Solberg." Zora sat up. "She already authenticated this piece," she said, 3 years before it came to the Foundation. "And her authentication record is here, in a government database, cross-referenced to the loan agreement, which means there's an existing authentication on record by the one independent expert in the consortium who hasn't been bought." She stood, forgetting the ankle, landing on it, breathing through the flare of pain. If she's already on record on this piece, they can't run the authentication review without her. She's the only voice with an established relationship to the artifact. They'd have to remove her from the process, which they can't do quietly, not with her name already in the government record. Nate was already typing. "I'm pulling Solberg's current contact details. Oslo." He paused. "She's been unreachable since yesterday morning. Contact form on her university page is down. Her department lists her as on research leave." Cold moved through the room. "They got to her," Zora said. "Or they tried to," Cassian said. He was already moving, crossing to the desk, looking at the screen over Nate's shoulder. "Research leave filed when?" "Day before yesterday." "Same day they moved up the authentication timeline." Cassian straightened. His face was doing the controlled thing, but at the edges now there was something that wasn't controlled, something that moved quickly behind his eyes. "They anticipated we'd go to Solberg. They cut the line before we could use it." "So we need to find her," Zora said. "We need to do several things simultaneously," Cassian said. "In the next," he looked at his watch, 6 hours and 40 minutes before the review window opens. And we have no secure base, a compromised network, and one prosecutor who may or may not move fast enough. The room went quiet. Zora looked at the camera in her hand, the photographs on it, the loan agreement, the registration number, Solberg's authentication cross-reference. None of it was nothing. All of it together was still not enough. She thought about what Che had been doing for 11 years. The patience of it. The architecture. The number of people who knew pieces of it and had calculated that knowing a piece was safer than knowing the whole. She thought about her own 11 years. Every time she'd raised a concern and been told she'd misunderstood. Every time a room had decided, before she opened her mouth, what the value of what she was about to say would be. "The gala," she said. Both men looked at her. "The Foundation's charity gala. It's tonight." She'd seen it in the planning documents for months. The recovered Joseon scroll, dramatically unveiled. The Foundation demonstrating its commitment to cultural heritage following the regrettable incident of the theft. They were going to use it. The unveiling. Proof that the painting was recovered, that the insurance matter is resolved, that the Foundation handled everything with integrity. That's why the review needs to clear by midnight, so the transfer is complete before the gala, and the gala becomes the clean public face of the whole operation. Cassian was watching her. 300 people, he said. International media, trustees, government officials, cultural ambassadors. And a live broadcast, Nate said quietly. He'd pulled it up on his screen. The Foundation partnered with a streaming platform, estimated audience of 40,000 concurrent viewers internationally. She looked at the screen, at the broadcast details, at the estimated audience number. She said, "We don't need Solberg's voice. We need the evidence to reach a space where it can't be suppressed." She looked at Cassian. "You said the prosecutor needs what we have to freeze the transfer. But what if the transfer freezes itself, because the evidence becomes public first, in a place so visible that acting on it becomes the only option for every official in the room?" Cassian looked at her for a long moment. "The gala," he said. "I have the original surveillance footage on a drive you gave me. I have the loan agreement photographs. I have the Heritage Board registration number that cross-references Solberg's existing authentication. And I have access to the one thing inside that building that nobody is expecting tonight." "What's that?" Nate said. "The conservation wing," she said. "I know it better than anyone in the Foundation. I know every access point, every broadcast junction, every secondary screen connection in that building. I helped design the exhibition's AV integration 3 months ago because they needed someone who understood both the artifact handling requirements and the technical installation specs, and I was the only person qualified to do both." She looked at Cassian. "I can get the footage onto every screen in that ballroom," she said, "during the unveiling, in front of every camera and every official and every feed going out internationally." Silence. Then Nate said flatly, "They'll have you arrested the second you walk in." "Yes," she said. "Which is why the footage needs to be already running before they realize I'm there. And if it doesn't work, then I'm arrested and charged and it ends there." She heard herself say it and didn't look away from it. But if it does work, the transfer gets frozen because no consortium in the world is going to clear an insurance claim on an artifact whose entire provenance is being litigated in real time on a live international broadcast. Another silence. Longer. Cassian said, "I'll be in the building." "You don't have to." "I'll be in the building," he repeated. Not negotiable, not performative, simply a fact being established. She looked at him. She thought about a girl in Eastern Europe who was alive because her father had done what was in front of him without calculating the return. She thought about the specific weight of a debt you couldn't pay to the person who incurred it. "Okay," she said. They had 5 hours. Nate spent them building. She didn't have words for what exactly he was building, but she watched enough of it to understand the architecture. A file package, compressed and encrypted, containing the original surveillance footage, the Heritage Board records, the loan agreement photographs, the communication records showing Daniel's contact with Che's network, and a forensic analysis of the surveillance alteration that he'd been running in the background for 20 hours. A package that could be transmitted to every registered media outlet in the consortium in the time it took to push a button, tied to a secondary trigger. If the primary broadcast was cut, if the gala's AV system was isolated before the footage finished playing, the package went out automatically to 47 journalists across 12 countries. Dead Man's Switch, she'd heard it called. She preferred to think of it as insurance. Cassian disappeared for 2 hours and came back with things she didn't ask about. New phones, a case she understood contained the kind of equipment that wasn't available retail, and an update that the prosecutor, he still hadn't told her name, had received the initial file transfer and was in motion. "How much in motion?" Zora said. "She has a judge on call." He was checking something in the case. "The standard for freezing an international insurance transfer is probable cause of fraud. What we sent her this afternoon clears that bar. She needs 3 hours to process the paperwork. We have 5. We had 5 40 minutes ago." She looked at her watch. "Right. The gala starts at 8, she said. The unveiling is scheduled for 9:30. That's the moment. The unveiling, the cameras all on the painting, all feeds live. We need to be inside before 8. Cassian looked up from the case. "The building will lock down its secondary access points at 7:50. After that, the only entry is through the main entrance under full security. So we have 90 minutes, Nate said from the desk. She looked at herself in the black window. Jeans, gray pullover, left shoe that fit worse than it had this morning. She looked like someone who had been running since yesterday and was still running, which was accurate. "I'm going to need different clothes," she said. "Try it." The gala dress was deep green, borrowed from someone she didn't ask Cassian to identify, and it fit like it had been made for someone with her exact measurements, which probably meant it had been. She put it on in a back room of Nate's building and looked at herself in the smudged mirror on the inside of the closet door. She looked like someone who belonged in a ballroom. That was the point. That was exactly the problem with this plan, and exactly its only advantage. Nate appeared in the doorway. He was wearing a suit that looked like it surprised him. She said, "You're coming." "Someone has to run the secondary trigger." He held up a phone. "And I'm faster on a keyboard than anyone Cassian brought." She looked at him. Nate, who had been annoyed when she arrived because she'd disrupted a 2-year timeline, who had handed her a terminal and gotten out of her way, who had spent 20 hours building something that was either going to work or wasn't. "Thank you," she said. He made a face like the words had landed wrong. "Don't thank me until we know if it works," he said. Exactly what Minjun had said. She was developing a fondness for people who deferred gratitude. Cassian was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Black suit, no tie, which on him read not casual, but deliberate. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She said, "Don't. I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say something careful and composed, and I don't have room for it right now." The corner of his mouth moved. "I was going to say the car is ready," he said. She walked past him toward the door. The Grand Seohan Arts Center occupied an entire city block in central Seoul, and on a gala night, it became something slightly unreal. Lights strung between the exterior columns, a carpet that wasn't red but close, cars pulling up in a sequence that suggested choreography. 300 people in the kind of clothes that meant money wasn't the point, because money had long since become background. They entered at 7:48 through the service entrance Zora had used during the AV installation 3 months ago. A door in the building's northwest face that was used by caterers and technical staff, and that she knew because she'd held it open for a delivery of track lighting on a Tuesday afternoon, while the lead installer explained the broadcast junction configuration to her in a combination of Korean and English that she'd followed about 80% of. She'd been grateful for the 80%. Inside, the particular controlled chaos of an event in its final preparation. Staff moving with purpose. No one looking at faces when they were looking at clipboards. She moved with the quality of someone who knew where she was going, which was the conservation wing, which was accessible from the gala building through a connecting corridor on the second floor that was normally locked, but that had been opened for the evening because the supposedly recovered scroll was being held there under its protective case for the pre-unveiling period. Cassian was behind her and to the left. Nate had split off at the entrance to position himself at the secondary broadcast junction. The corridor was quiet. She went through it quickly, her green dress brushing the walls in the narrow passage, her left ankle talking to her with every step in a voice she was choosing to ignore. The conservation wing entrance required a key card. She used Minjun's. It still worked. They hadn't thought to deactivate it. That was the first thing that went right all day, and she allowed herself exactly 2 seconds of acknowledgement before pushing through. The wing was dim and climate-controlled, the familiar smell of it hitting her like something physical. Archival paper and specific chemical compounds and the particular neutral quality of air that was kept at constant humidity. She knew every inch of this space. She'd spent 18 months of her life in it. Against the far wall, under a sealed protective case on a transport mount, was the Joseon scroll. She looked at it. It was real. Or it was a reproduction precise enough to fool anyone who hadn't put their hands on the original, which she had, which meant she was looking at it with the particular authority of someone who had spent hours with the real thing. The silk ground had the right oxidation pattern. The ink tonality was exact. The mounting hardware was original period material. But she moved closer, closer than she should, closer than protocol allowed, close enough to put her face 12 inches from the case's protective panel, the lower left corner of the scroll. A tiny repair, almost invisible. A section of consolidation work where a flaking area had been stabilized with Japanese tissue and wheat starch paste. She'd done that repair herself, 7 months ago. She knew the exact texture of the tissue she'd used, the way it caught the light at a specific angle. The repair on this scroll was in the right place, but the tissue caught the light wrong. She stayed very still. "It's a reproduction," she said. Cassian behind her. "What?" "The scroll in this case is not the original." Her voice came out flat and precise. "The insurance transfer is clearing against an artifact that isn't here. They moved the original through the transaction and put a copy in the case for the unveiling. So even if we broadcast the footage tonight, even if the transfer freezes," she turned. "The original is already gone. It's been moved. The money is already moving." Cassian's face did something she hadn't seen it do before. Not fear, something colder than fear. The recognition of a game that had been played at a level higher than the one they'd been playing on. "Nate," she said it into the earpiece. Static. Then Nate's voice, lower than usual. "I'm at the junction. The primary system is accessible. But Zora, there are 2 men here who weren't on any staff manifest. They're not looking at me yet, but how long to execute the broadcast? 4 minutes once I start. If nobody stops me. How long before they stop you?" A pause. "Maybe 2. She looked at Cassian. He was already moving, reaching for his phone. She said, "If the transfer is already in motion, does the prosecutor have enough to claw it back?" "Only if she files within the next—" He checked his watch. His jaw went tight. 40 minutes. After that, it clears the consortium's settlement window and it's gone. 40 minutes. 300 people in the ballroom below them. A live broadcast feed feeding 40,000 more. A dead man switch on 47 journalists. A federal prosecutor with a judge on call. A reproduction scroll in a case. An original somewhere in transit. And a mole she still didn't know the name of, who knew every move Cassian had made. She looked at the scroll in its case. At the wrong light on the tissue repair. At the conservation wing around her. The space she'd worked in for 18 months. The space that had been the backdrop for everything done to her. The ballroom PA crackled below. A voice welcoming guests. The particular warm reverberance of a room with 300 people in it. She pulled the earpiece out and looked at Cassian. "Go to the prosecutor," she said, right now. Call her. Give her everything. The original footage, the loan agreement, the transfer timeline. You have 40 minutes. Go." "I'm not leaving you. Nate needs someone at the junction who can buy him 2 minutes. And you need to be somewhere with a phone and a direct line to someone who can freeze that transfer." She looked at him. "You can't do both. I can do one of them." He looked at her. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of the event below and the HVAC and her own pulse, which was very loud and very present. "The man who came through the archive door," Cassian said. "He wasn't alone. There will be at least 2 more in this building working for Che. I know. Your ankle." "Cassian." She said his name and it stopped him. "Go. I know this building better than anyone they'll send." Something moved across his face, not the controlled surface, underneath it, brief and real and then gone. He put something in her hand. She looked down. A small radio, 1 channel, 1 button. "That reaches me directly," he said. 1 press. She put it in the fold of her dress. He went. She turned to the conservation wing door, through the second-floor corridor down to the main building's AV junction room where Nate was running his clock down against two men who didn't belong on any manifest. She went through the door. The corridor was empty. She was halfway to the junction room when the door at the far end opened and a man came through it who was not Nate and was not staff, and who looked at her green dress and her face and recognized both. He reached for something at his jacket. She was already moving, cutting left into the narrow alcove beside the building services panel, a space she knew was there because she'd helped route a cable through it during the AV installation, a space that was exactly wide enough for one person and that had, on its interior face, a manual override panel for the building's secondary broadcast system. She hit her back against the wall inside the alcove as the man reached the corridor. She could hear him breathing. She could hear her own heart. She could hear, through the floor, the murmur of 300 people waiting for a painting that wasn't there to be unveiled on a live international feed. She looked at the override panel 6 inches from her left hand. She thought about Nate's 4 minutes, his 2 minutes, the math of what she was holding. She flipped open the panel cover. Inside, a row of input switches and a broadcast selector, exactly as the installer had explained it to her on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd been holding a door open for lighting equipment and listening with 80% comprehension to a man who had no idea what she'd eventually need the information for. She needed the other 20% right now. The footsteps in the corridor stopped. He'd worked out where she was. She looked at the panel, at the switches, at the broadcast selector, which had 4 positions, and she was almost certain position 3 was the one she needed, but almost certain was a long way from certain. And if she was wrong, she wasn't just wrong, she flipped the selector and hit the first switch and the second and prayed to nothing because there was nothing to pray to. Just the panel and her hands and the 80% she knew and the 20% she didn't. And then the corridor flooded with sound, not from beside her, but from below, from the ballroom, the building's entire secondary broadcast system waking up at once, a low harmonic hum she felt through the wall at her back. The footsteps outside the alcove rushed forward. She hit the 3rd switch. The man's hand came around the alcove edge and grabbed her left arm at the wrist, yanked, and she came out of the space sideways, and the pain from her ankle as she landed wrong was the color white, and she couldn't help the sound she made. It came out of her before she could stop it, and he turned her hard into the corridor wall with the particular efficiency of someone trained to control a person's body before they can use it. Her right hand still had the radio. She pressed the button once, and then his grip moved to her wrist, and the radio hit the floor. "Done," he said. He wasn't talking to her. From somewhere below, through the floor, through the walls, she heard something change. The ambient sound of the ballroom, the murmur, the music, cut, replaced by something else. A voice she didn't recognize at first, coming through speakers that were now running on the secondary system she'd just activated. And then she recognized it as Nate's pre-recorded narration, the text he'd written to accompany the footage package, the context that made the images legible to 300 people who'd come here for champagne and a painting. The man holding her heard it too. His grip changed, not loosening, but his attention divided. That was the moment. She dropped her weight straight down, the way you drop it when someone is holding you upright, and you become suddenly uncooperative with gravity. And his grip on her wrist bent her arm the wrong direction before it released and she hit the floor on her knees, and the ankle screamed and she was already moving, crawling 2 feet into the junction room door and pushing through it. Nate was inside. Standing at the main board with blood on his left eyebrow from a cut she couldn't locate the source of, and his hands moving across the interface with the specific focus of a man who has decided the rest of his body is irrelevant. One of the 2 men from the manifest was on the floor, not moving. She didn't ask. The other wasn't in the room. "Where's—" she started. "Handled," Nate said without looking up. "Primary feed is live. 42 seconds in." She got to her feet using the doorframe. Through the junction room's monitor feed, she could see the ballroom, the screens on every wall playing footage she recognized, the original surveillance from Gallery 7, the real version, timestamp 917, showing an empty room, and then the 2 figures entering through the restoration corridor with their tools and their practiced efficiency. 300 people who had come to see a painting were watching a crime instead. The man from the corridor came through the door behind her. She grabbed the nearest thing. a cable management bar from the wall rack, heavy, aluminum. And she turned and swung it and hit him across the forearm, and the sound was bad, and he made a sound that was worse, and he went sideways into the wall, and she hit him again across the shoulder, not the head. Not the head. She was very conscious of not the head, and he went down and stayed. She stood over him breathing in gasps. Her hands were shaking. The cable bar was still in her fist. Nate said from the board, 3 minutes, 50 seconds. She put the bar down against the wall carefully, like putting down something she didn't want to be holding but was responsible for. Is it transmitting? She said. Everything. The forensic analysis, the Heritage Board records, the communication logs between Daniel Park and Che's network, all of it, hitting the media package in about 90 seconds. He looked at the monitor. And the prosecutor just confirmed receipt of the transfer freeze documentation. 8 minutes ago. She hadn't heard him say that through the earpiece. She'd already been in the alcove. Did it go through? She said. The freeze. She filed 4 minutes ago. He looked at his watch. If the judge signs it in the next 20 minutes, the transfer window closes before settlement. 20 minutes. She looked at the monitor, at the ballroom, at the screens. On one of the feeds, she could see Chairman Marcus Che in the third row of the audience. She'd met him twice. Both times he'd been charming in the specific way of people who understand that charm is a resource to be allocated strategically. Right now, he was on his feet, and the man beside him was on a phone. And even on the low-resolution monitor feed, she could read the thing happening in Che's body language. Not panic, not yet, but the first movement of something that had been still for 11 years and was now being required to move. She watched him turn toward the exit. Cassian was already there. She found out later, from Nate, who pulled the building's remaining security feed, Chimbafi, and from Cassian himself, in shorter and less detailed terms, what happened at the ballroom's east exit at approximately 9:51 p.m. on a Thursday evening in front of several credentialed journalists and one government official who had come to the gala as a guest and who would later describe what he saw with the careful precision of someone reconstructing an event for a formal report. Che had moved fast. The man had survived 11 years in the kind of operational shadow that destroys most people, which required a particular combination of patience and the ability to read a room's threat level accurately. He'd read it correctly tonight. He'd moved within 40 seconds of the footage beginning. The east exit led to a service elevator that went to the roof. On the roof, a helicopter that appeared on no official manifest, but that had been logged by a curious building maintenance worker who'd mentioned it to no one because mentioning things was not his job. Cassian reached the exit 11 seconds before Che. He was alone. The team he'd built, and one member of which had fed information to the man now walking toward him, was elsewhere in the building, deployed to positions that now meant nothing. He was alone in a hallway with a man who employed people whose specific professional competency was solving problems like Cassian, and the two men walking behind Che were exactly that. What happened in that hallway was not neat. Cassian came away from it with 3 broken ribs and a gash across his right forearm that would need 16 stitches, and that he wouldn't mention until 4 hours later when Nate noticed he was holding his right arm at an angle that wasn't voluntary. What Che came away with was 2 sets of zip restraints and a corridor floor, and the particular stillness of someone who has run every calculation and found that all of them have closed. The helicopter left without him. Someone in Cassian's phone call earlier had ensured that. She didn't know who. She'd stopped asking about the architecture of his connections because the architecture was vast, and she'd decided she could map it over time, which was a thought she noticed herself having and filed quietly. The arrest happened on a live feed watched by a later audited figure of 63,000 concurrent international viewers. Not Che's. His happened in the hallway, quietly. The arrests that went out on camera were the ones in the ballroom. 2 foundation trustees whose names appeared in the communication records. The senior acquisitions associate who had coordinated the physical logistics of moving the scroll through the restoration corridor. And Dr. Woo Seong-jin, head of acquisitions, who was located near the bar holding a glass of wine he hadn't drunk when officers from the National Office of Investigation entered through the main ballroom doors at 10:04 p.m. She watched it on the junction room monitor. She watched Woo see them coming and do nothing. Not run, not speak. Just set the wine glass down on the nearest surface with a careful deliberateness, the way you put something down when you understand you won't be picking it up again. She thought about him in his office, the key in his inside pocket, the meeting with Che in the corridor that Min-jun had seen, all the small administrative acts that had been, underneath their surface, the architecture of what was done to her. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. She'd expected something like satisfaction. What she felt was closer to exhaustion, not the physical kind, though that was present and significant, but the exhaustion of a weight she'd been carrying since the interrogation room, since the news ticker, since a phone playing a statement from a man who'd said he never truly knew her, finally making contact with the ground. Nate came to stand beside her at the monitor. He said, "Transfer freeze went through." She looked at him. "Judge signed it 8 minutes ago," he said. "The insurance consortium has been formally notified. The settlement window is closed." She put one hand on the edge of the board and let it take some of her weight, just for a moment. "The scroll," she said. "The real one." Che's people had it in a climate-controlled transport container in a warehouse in Incheon. The prosecutor had the location from data in the communication records. Customs and enforcement are there now. He paused. "It's fine. Temperature controlled the whole time, apparently. Whoever he had handling it knew what they were doing." She thought about the reproduction in the case upstairs, the wrong light on the tissue repair, the detail no one else in this building would have seen because no one else had spent hours at that piece with their hands. 11 years of expertise, used by everyone around her as a credential to establish her believability as a suspect. Turned out that same 11 years was the thing that unraveled them. There was something in that she didn't have words for. Not poetic, just true. Bachin. Daniel was arrested at 11:20 at his apartment in Yongsan. She knew this because Cassian told her, seated across from her in the back of a vehicle she hadn't identified, with his right arm held at that wrong angle and blood dried on his collar that wasn't his, she thought, and then looked more carefully and decided some of it was. "How long did you know about Daniel?" she said. 6 weeks, he said. She looked at him. "We identified the intermediary he was in contact with 6 weeks ago," he said. "Tracing back to Daniel took another 2 weeks. By the time we were certain, you were already named in the theft. You knew for 4 weeks that my fiancé had been feeding security information to the people who framed me. Yes? And you didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." She breathed in through her nose. Out. "That's not the same thing," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." She looked out the window. The city was doing its ordinary late-night things, a couple outside a convenience store, a dog on a leash. The specific light of Seoul at 11 p.m. that she'd found beautiful when she first arrived because it had an energy that Chicago didn't, something that moved differently. "Why?" she said. "Not the operational reason? Why?" He was quiet for a moment. He was, she had learned, a man who used silence the way other people used words, not to avoid answering, but to make sure the answer was accurate. "Because you were already carrying enough," he said finally, "and knowing 4 weeks earlier wouldn't have changed what you needed to do. It would have changed what you could hold." She thought about that. The part of her that wanted to be angry at the decision found, when it arrived there, that the anger had less material than expected. She understood the calculation. She even understood the care in it. "Don't do that again," she said. "No," he said. Simple. No qualification. She noted that. Min-jun came to the National Office of Investigation the following morning and gave a full statement. She knew this because the prosecutor, whose name she finally learned was Kim Yoon-ji, a woman of 41 with short hair and the particular brisk efficiency of someone who had spent a career building cases against people who expected not to be touched, called her afterward and told her. "His testimony about the call he received the morning of the theft is significant," Kim told her. "It establishes premeditated suppression of witness testimony, which elevates several of the charges." A pause. "He was frightened, but he came." "I know," Zora said. "You trusted him." "I made a calculation," she said, and then more honestly, "and I knew him." Slightly different thing. After the call, she sat in the room Cassian's people had set up, in a location she didn't ask the address of, and thought about the distinction between trust and knowledge. How in her field you never trusted a material. You analyzed it. You understood its structure and its history and its failure points, and then you worked with what you knew. Trust was for things you couldn't analyze. Knowledge was better. Knowledge was what you had when you'd been paying attention long enough. She'd been paying attention to Minjun for 18 months. That wasn't trust. That was evidence. The mole in Kashin's operation was a man named Victor, who had worked for him for 7 years and who had been in contact with Che's network for the last 9 months after a family debt that Che's people had purchased and leveraged. When Cassian found this out, through the same communication records that had destroyed everyone else, he didn't tell her what happened next, and she didn't ask, and there was a version of that exchange that she would have found troubling 6 days ago, and a version she found simply accurate now. And she wasn't entirely comfortable with the distance between those two versions, but she held them both and understood that the world she'd walked into was not the world she'd been in before, and that the relevant question wasn't how she felt about it, but what she intended to do with herself inside it. The formal charges against Zora Bennett were dropped 14 days after the gala. The announcement was made by the Seoul Metropolitan Police in a statement that used the phrase procedural review of evidence and did not use the word apology, which was consistent with institutions and inconsistent with any honest accounting of what had occurred. She didn't expect the apology. She'd stopped expecting those from institutions around the time she understood that institutions experience accountability the way water experiences a hill. They route around it until they find the path of least resistance. What mattered was the record. Every charge struck, every public filing amended. The statement from the Foundation's communications director, the one that had called her a contracted specialist, formally retracted and replaced with a document acknowledging her role and her record, and the wrongful nature of the accusations made against her. She read that document 3 times, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to know what it felt like. It felt like less than she'd imagined and more real than anything else she'd read in 2 weeks. Kim Yoon-ji called with the final charge summary 6 weeks later. 17 individuals across 4 countries. Marcus Che facing charges in 3 jurisdictions, the most serious of which carried a sentence that Kim described in the measured tone of someone who believed in the accuracy of outcomes without celebrating them. Daniel Park had accepted a cooperation agreement in exchange for his full testimony, which meant a reduced sentence and a public record that Zora understood she would encounter the existence of for the rest of her professional life. She asked Kim directly, "Was the engagement real?" Kim was quiet for a moment. His early communications with Che's network predate your relationship by 3 months. The initial contact appears to have been financial. The relationship itself, another pause. The records don't answer that question. She sat with that for a long time after the call ended. She'd concluded, eventually, that she was going to have to live with not knowing. That the most honest assessment was, some of it was real and some of it was calculation, and the line between them and a person doing both simultaneously was not something the evidence could locate. That was its own kind of loss, distinct from all the other losses, and it didn't resolve. It just became something she carried in a different way than she'd been carrying it. She was good at carrying things. She'd built a career around the careful management of fragile, irreplaceable objects. She understood weight. She understood that the goal wasn't to put it down, but to distribute it correctly. She registered the foundation 3 months after the charges were dropped. The Bennett Institute for Cultural Heritage, a name that would have embarrassed her a year ago because it sounded like something you named after yourself when you'd won, and she'd never thought of what she was doing as a competition with winners. But her father had told her once, sitting in his kitchen in Chicago on a Sunday afternoon, coffee getting cold while he read something she couldn't see, that the best argument for doing a thing correctly was a record of it being done. You didn't make the argument with words. You made it with the record. She named it after him, because he was the record. The Institute focused on 2 things: protecting cultural heritage artifacts from fraudulent transfer, working with legal and forensic specialists to track provenance in markets that had historically operated on the assumption that scrutiny was optional, and supporting working conservators, particularly those early in their careers, particularly those working against the particular headwind of being in rooms where people had decided before they spoke what the value of what they were about to say would be. She knew something about that headwind. She understood its specific physics. Mamen. Cashin came to the Institute's opening 3 months after that. Not to the public event. She hadn't told him about it, and he'd found out through means she didn't investigate. He was waiting outside when she came out at the end of the evening. Dark coat. That stillness. His right arm had healed, and he carried it normally now, though when she looked, she could see the edge of the scar above his shirt cuff. "You should have been inside," she said. "I don't do well in rooms with that many people watching a single thing. It's a conservation institute, not a spectacle." "Same principle," he said. She stood beside him on the step outside, and they looked at the street together. It was October. The air had that quality of early cold. Not yet winter, but the suggestion of it, the way a room suggests the conversation that hasn't started yet. "The remaining networks," she said, "the ones you've been dismantling." "It's work," he said. "Legal work?" A pause. "More legal than before." She looked at him. He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to be something you aren't," she said. "I'm asking you to be honest about what you are." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm answering instead of redirecting." She found the corner of her mouth moving, noting the distinction between what he said and what other people would have said, which was the same content delivered differently, which was, she was finding, one of the more reliable ways to understand a person. "My father would have liked you," she said. "He liked people who said difficult things accurately." Cassian was quiet for a moment. Not the performance of feeling, the real version, the one that didn't perform. "He was a good man," he said. "He was complicated," she said. Same thing, often. 6 months later, she stood in the National Museum with Kim Yoon-ji at a ceremony she hadn't organized and hadn't been warned about, in which the Joseon scroll was formally returned to public cultural heritage status under a new protection agreement that meant it could never again be transferred for private insurance purposes. The scroll was mounted in a new conservation case she'd helped specify, with the proper microclimate controls and UV filtering and the particular attention to physical support that the piece required given its age and the stress of the last year. She looked at it for a long time. The lower left corner, the repair she'd made, the tissue catching the light exactly right now because it was the real piece and not the reproduction, and the light on real things behaved correctly, and she had always known the difference. Kim stood beside her, not talking. She'd learned that about Kim in 6 months. The woman understood the difference between silence that was empty and silence that was the appropriate response to what was in front of you. "What did it feel like," Kim said eventually, "when you knew you had it?" She thought about the alcove, the panel, the 80% and the 20%, and the moment she'd flipped the selector and not known. "Like being wrong and right at the same time," she said, "and having to act anyway." Kim looked at the scroll. "That's most of what this work is." "Yes," she said. "I know." She stood there in the museum's quiet, with the scroll in front of her and the institution around her that had tried to make her disappear and had instead produced the opposite result. And she thought about what her father had said about records, about how you made the argument with the record, not the words. The record was in front of her, restored, authenticated, in its case in the light, exactly as it should be. She had more work. She always had more work. The Institute had 3 active cases, 2 of them involving auction houses in markets that operated on the old assumption. And she had a meeting in 2 days with a conservator in Lagos who had documented 8 transactions she wanted to look at. And there was a stack of applications from early career specialists that she'd been reading at night, because she'd promised herself she'd read everyone personally. She had more work. She was going to do it. She looked at the scroll one last time, not as evidence, not as the object at the center of the worst year of her life, but as what it was, a 15th century landscape by someone who had looked at the world around them and found it worth the extraordinary effort of getting it exactly right. Mountains, water, light on a surface doing what light on that surface actually did. Somebody paid attention, she thought, a long time ago. And because they did, this exists. She turned away from it and walked back through the museum and out into the October street where Seoul moved around her exactly as it always had, indifferent and enormous and hers, in the way that any city becomes yours when you've survived it. She had her phone out before she reached the corner. Dialed Nate. He picked up on the second ring. The Legos conservator sent her documentation, she said. I'm sending it to you now. Tell me what you see. A pause. Then, without preamble, without anything that wasn't the work, give me an hour. You have 45 minutes, she said. She could hear him exhale. Not annoyed, just recalibrating. She'd learned that about Nate, too. She kept walking. The city moved around her. Somewhere behind her in its case, the scroll sat in exactly the right light. And somewhere ahead of her, the work continued, and she was the same person who had sat on a wet alley floor and broken. And she was not the same person at all. Both of those things were true. She'd stopped needing them to be otherwise.